Okay, hello everybody. Today we're going to finish up this lesson on why did war break out between North and South Vietnam in 1964. So if you can remember in lesson 2, we looked at three factors, all right? The first one, we looked at how basically Diem did not carry out national elections in 56, and because he failed to carry out these elections, people were upset with him. Then we talk about the role of South Vietnam, which basically Diem was in charge of South Vietnam and how his regime was unpopular and corrupted. And because of that, many Vietnamese resisted him. And later on, of course, it broke out into a war between North and South Vietnam. And then we talk about basically the role of North Vietnam and how Vietnam basically supported an insurgency in South Vietnam from 1954 to 1960, and how basically this insurgency later on contributed to the outbreak of the war in 1964. Today, we're going to look at the role of three so-called countries, right? The role of China, the role of USSR, and the role of USA. And if you ask me, when you think about these three countries, the USA's role will be, in some sense, the most important. Why? Because later on, the USA will come in to the Vietnam War and send troops in 1964. So we're going to look at that and examine these three countries. And first, we're going to look at China, all right? Now, the role of China. Now, why was Mao so eager to support China? Few reasons. Number one, basically, Vietnam was then, they were fighting, the communists versus Diem's government. And so Mao was eager to ensure that the whole of Vietnam became a communist country. And he felt a bond of loyalty towards Ho Chi Minh because Ho Chi Minh was a communist. And so Mao therefore decided to send weapons and support to Ho Chi Minh. Uh, Mao also wanted to support Ho Chi Minh because uh, he hopes that its forces would then become communist, and then later on, Vietnam would become an anti-US buffer. All right. So basically, in some sense, irritants to the United States. And Mao also got involved in the Vietnam War because, when you encourage people to go to war, sometimes it really unites the people because now you have a common enemy. So he hopes that by being involved in the war, it will help unite the Chinese people behind Mao's leadership. Now, what about the USSR? Now, the USSR, especially in the early 1960s, they were quite cautious about getting involved in Vietnam. They don't really want to commit because they are afraid to be sucked into a war. And once they are stuck in a war, then obviously war is a costly affair. So they were quite cautious at the start, and they were actually quite fearful that if they got too involved, then a big war will break out between the USA and the USSR, which actually USSR doesn't want. USSR doesn't want to have a big war with USA because that will be disastrous on both sides. In the 1950s, the USSR did support Ho's struggle against the French. If you can recall, at the early stages of the first Indochina War. So the USSR did give some support, and the USSR did provide support for the formation of the Viet Cong. So some support, right? But during the mid 1950s, what happened was that Russia, USSR, and China, their relationship basically, due to certain reasons, started to deteriorate. And this period is known as the Sino-Soviet split because, in terms of relationship, they fell apart, they split. So even though the two of them are communists, but yet they did not actually see eye to eye with each other, and there were deep tensions between the two countries. And what that meant for North Vietnam was that North Vietnam had to play a balancing act between the USSR and China's interests so as to gain aid and support from both countries. What this means was basically North Vietnam wanted aid from both, but North Vietnam cannot be seen as siding one country over the other, because if you do that, then the other country might not be happy. And so it was really a delicate balancing act to ensure that both countries, the USSR and China, in some sense, will continue to support North Vietnam, and they will not think that North Vietnam is siding too much to either so-called country. So it was really a delicate balancing act. You can see in the cartoon over here, this cartoon actually depicts the Sino-Soviet split. Okay, you can see Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is over here on the right. This man over here, Khrushchev, all right, is Khrushchev. He's the bald person. Of course, he symbolizes USSR. And you can see that the two of them are, in like some sense, fighting one another. This was taken in 1963. In 1963, basically, the Soviet split, the Sino-Soviet split got worse. Okay, so tensions really were quite bad between these two countries. Now, during the mid-1960s, the USSR tried to assert its leadership as the leader of the communist world. And so the USSR provided more arms and other essential supplies to North Vietnam. And by the late 1960s, the USSR was providing more support to North Vietnam than China, providing things like aircraft, surface-to-air missiles. So, of course, this caused China to be quite upset, because Vietnam or North Vietnam seems to be having close ties with the USSR. All right. Now we come to, in my opinion, the most important country in causing the Vietnam War, and that's the role of the USA, because USA would send huge amount of troops into Vietnam. And let's see what happens. So from USA's perspective, they were convinced that China and the USSR was planning to spread communism, okay, to countries all over Asia. So there was this fear within the government of USA that communism was spreading, and USA believed very strongly that if Vietnam fell to the communists, then other countries will start to fall to communism. So China already fallen. North Korea was also communist. So now the next country within Southeast Asia, the fear was Vietnam. And the USA wanted to stop communism from spreading. And this fear that if one country falls and another country will become communist, this so-called theory is known as the domino theory. All right, the domino theory. And the domino theory basically was first coined by US President Eisenhower. Okay, and basically is the based on the belief if one country fell to communism, the others would fall to, just like a row of dominoes. So you can see in this picture over here, if Vietnam fell, then Laos would fall, Cambodia will fall, Thailand will fall, and basically it goes on. But you can see that there is this man at the other end. Of course, this man at the other end symbolizes the USA. And so the USA was trying to prevent, in some sense, communism from spreading, because they had this belief in the domino theory. All right. Now, the USA obviously supported then the anti-communist governments all around the world. And this included Diem's government in South Vietnam. Okay, so even though Diem's government was very corrupted and autocratic, but the USA decided to support Diem because Diem is anti-communist. And this idea of supporting anti-communists and ensuring that they do not fall into communism, this US policy was known as containment. Okay, you are trying to contain the spread of communism. And in 1961, US President Kennedy adopted this cautious approach towards Vietnam, okay, to basically support them. All right. He sent military advisors to train the South Vietnamese armies. He also supplied military equipment. And these efforts were later on organized under the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or the MACV. So under the leadership of President Kennedy, there was support. Okay, not so great yet, but at least there was support to Diem's government in South Vietnam. Now, unfortunately, in 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in the USA. All right, he was basically shot. And so, obviously, after the president was being killed, his successor took over. And this person is known as Lyndon Johnson. So you can see in this picture over here, this is Lyndon Johnson. And President Johnson basically was more convinced and more prepared than Kennedy to commit the US to a full-scale conflict in Vietnam to contain communism. So Kennedy was more cautious, but after he died, this President Johnson, was more gung-ho. Okay, he really wanted to send troops. And why was President Johnson more willing to engage in war? A few reasons. Number one, in 63, Diem was assassinated by South Vietnamese military commanders because he's so corrupted, right? Even his own commanders didn't like him. So you can see in this picture here, he was shot and killed in a 63 coup. And due to his death, right, USA then realized that now South Vietnam is a bit unstable. Okay, South Vietnam lacked a strong leader because Diem basically was killed. And so President Johnson was now more willing to send more help and more troops, all right, to South Vietnam. Another reason why President Johnson was more willing to engage in war was because China exploded its first atomic bomb in 64. All right, and after you explode the atomic bomb, what happens now is that China now becomes a nuclear power, and so China becomes a greater danger. That's number one. Number two, USSR also showed little interest in peaceful coexistence with the West. And so President Johnson felt that, okay, maybe it's time now to exert the US military might to contain communism. Now, the USA needed a trigger event to send in their troops. And this trigger event came on 2nd August 1964. So what happened was that 2nd August 1964, North Vietnamese patrol boats, they went to attack, all right, a US destroyer known as the USS Maddox, all right? So later on, it's also reported that another US so-called ship was being attacked. So first, 2nd August, then 4th August, another one being attacked. Now, this is all reported. So when President Johnson learned that basically his 2 US ships were being attacked by North Vietnam patrol boats, obviously he got very upset and he urged US Congress to basically pass a resolution. And this resolution was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Why was it called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution? Because the reported attack by the US ships, right, being attacked by North Vietnamese boats occurred in the Tonkin Gulf, which is basically the sea between North Vietnam and this Hainan Island. Okay, so this area over here. So in the resolution, the US Congress agreed that the USA could take necessary measures to prevent aggression and achieve peace and security in Vietnam. In other words, the Congress agreed that the president could send in troops into Vietnam to fight the communists so that hopefully Vietnam would achieve some kind of peace. But actually, in other words, basically, they didn't want Vietnam to fall under the hands of the communists. So US troops now started to go into Vietnam. And when the US troops began to go into Vietnam, this essentially was the start of the Vietnam War. Or some people even call this the start of the Second Indo-China War. All right? But your textbook says this is the start of the Vietnam War in 1964. So US troops go into Vietnam. US also began to ask some of its allies from Australia, Britain, New Zealand, and South Korea to also contribute soldiers over the course of the war. Okay. So let's reflect and recap some of the key factors that we have talked about so far on why did war break out between North and South Vietnam in 64. We talk about the Geneva Conference, and you can recall in the Geneva Conference, Vietnam was divided into two along the 17th parallel. This, in some sense, laid the foundation for future conflict. Diem did not carry out national elections that caused people to be very upset. Diem's regime in South Vietnam was very unpopular and corrupt. So corrupt was he that even his own commanders would kill him. And later on, when he was assassinated, the USA also felt that it was right to go into Vietnam, and therefore the war broke out. We talked about the role of North Vietnam, how North Vietnam basically supported the Viet Cong in this insurgency to fight the South Vietnamese. And so in some sense, even before 64, there's already skirmishes, battles taking place between Viet Cong and South Vietnam. And, the situation was just so unstable that eventually a war will break out. We talk about the role of China and the role of USSR. They did send troops. They did send, not troops, they did send military equipment, they did send weapons to support North Vietnam. And of course, this helps North Vietnam to prepare itself for war. And of course, last but not least, we talk about the role of the USA and how under the leadership of President Johnson, basically President Johnson decided that, okay, we are going to enter into war. And the trigger event was really the Gulf of Tonkin incident, whereby Vietnamese patrol boats, attacked US destroyers, and that in some sense triggered the war in 1964. All right. So I've come to the end of this part of the lesson on the causes of the Vietnam War. And very soon, basically, you are going to also start to do an essay question that's worth 10 marks. All right. And the question really is the most important reason why war broke out between North and South Vietnam in 64 was due to the unpopularity of Diem's actions. So the given factor obviously is the unpopularity of Diem's action. You can talk about other factors. Some can talk about the role of the USA. Some can talk about the role of North Vietnam. Okay, and of course, some of you all might even talk about basically the Geneva Conference and how basically Vietnam was partitioned and that contributed to the war. So there are many factors you can consider as you answer this question. All right. So that comes to the end of the lesson. Remember to do your MCQ questions on this lesson, and I will see you soon in week 9. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a great day. Bye.